Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Carol Richardson, and I'm a museum coordinator for the A.Quinn Jones Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our newest exhibition. This is a partnership with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, entitled City of Hope, Resurrection City, the 1968 Poor People's Campaign. And one of the things we wanted to do with this exhibit, because we have a new generation of young people that just don't know this history, we have an older generation of people who don't know this history. So as we put this exhibit together, we wanted to bring in some people that could help us educate each other, educate me. And I'm always talking to my favorite historian, Dr. Paul Ortiz, about any and everything. We've had the opportunity to work together for years on radio, and throughout here at the museum there are some oral history interviews of people from the Gainesville, Alachua County area that the Samuel Proctor put together. I'm happy that Flo Torcott, who curated most of the exhibits that you see here that's related to A.Quinn Jones and also the Lincoln exhibit. So this is a very special night for us to bring something new to Gainesville and to have Dr. Paul Ortiz here to talk to us about the Poor People's Campaign. Please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Paul Ortiz.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Carol. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak here at this great historical place. I have some show and tell things to share with you as a historian. I feel like I'm not doing my job unless I have handouts. As Jake and Barbara can tell you, I just gave a talk to retired faculty yesterday. I think I gave too many handouts yesterday, Jake, so I limited myself today. So let me explain the handouts real quickly. So there's the one handout that I did bring enough copies for everyone to have a copy is the actual news release that Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference released actually when they finally made the decision to organize the Poor People's Campaign. It was a very difficult decision because everyone within the leadership circle, and these are people who have tremendous organizing CVs. People like Bayard Rustin, who organized the 1963 March on Washington. People like, of course, Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, who was kind of a young but upcoming leader. A lot of movement people didn't want Dr. King to move forward with the Poor People's Campaign. They knew it would be very controversial. When you read this release, you'll kind of see why. And I'm not going to read it. You can just read it at your leisure. But basically, the idea behind the Poor People's Campaign was to build upon both African American histories of struggle, but also ideas about how to deal with poverty in ways that corporate America were just not dealing with poverty. And there were a number of people that were kind of pushing the civil rights movement to do something big about poverty because, well, in part, there were so many poor people in the United States. And so many of the people who had sacrificed, people in towns like Marks, Mississippi, you have to kind of remember the Mississippi Delta in the 50s and the 60s. And these were communities where people literally risked their lives to register to vote, to pay their poll taxes. And many of them have been brutalized. Some have been lynched. Every summer, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, I take students to the Mississippi Delta, and we interview people who still remember those days, some of the people who experienced those things. And by the mid-'60s, in many of those communities in Mississippi, in rural Arkansas, North Florida, et cetera, communities had won the right to vote, but they were still desperately impoverished. And one of the origin stories behind the Poor People's Campaign is actually Dr. King going and visiting the community in Marks, Mississippi that had a very strong NAACP chapter that had hosted civil rights workers, both black and white and Hispanic, and where people were beginning to vote, but were so poor that many of the children were going to school without breakfast. And so Federal Head Start started in 1965, but the federal government was really just beginning to address poverty issues, and it's such a slow pace. It's such a slow pace that it radicalized people like Robert F. Kennedy. This always kind of amazes me, because when you think about a person like Robert F. Kennedy, you think about a person who really begins doing a lot of errands for his much more famous brother, who just happened to be president of the United States, but was kind of conservative. And Robert F. Kennedy started encountering poverty and immiseration, and he was actually one of the people that pushed Dr. King on the Poor People's Campaign. He said, we've got to do something big here. We've got to do something dramatic, because the situation is getting worse and worse. And of course, the biggest problem facing the civil rights movement in 1967, when Dr. King sent out that release, and facing the entire nation, and certainly facing people in Southeast Asia, was the American War in Vietnam. And Kennedy and King and many others said that basically the federal government is using the war in Vietnam to not just ignore, but to basically get people to just stop talking about poverty. And the excuse, if you read newspaper columns back then, is very clear, that the major opinion leaders were saying, we'd like to deal with these domestic issues, but we've got to support the troops. Sounds familiar, right? We're in much the same situation now. So there's a sense of urgency and a sense of immediacy in the sense that these civil rights activists who are part of SCLC, part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, part of the Congress of Racial Equality, and other organizations, were working in rural communities in the South that were still desperately poor after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The situation in the North, in many ways, was even worse. In the 1963 March on Washington, which, by the way, was the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, organized by Bayard Rustin and really fueled and energized by a national network of African-American socialist union members, especially people in unions like the United Auto Workers, District 65 out of New York. Basically, that march in '63, which you can kind of see as a bridge to the Poor People's Campaign 5 years later. But the March on Washington in 1963 was an economic statement, a march for jobs and freedom. Yes, political rights are important. Yes, all these other issues that we're fighting for, like education, like access, like desegregation are important, but none of those things really matter if you can't get a good paying job. And the fact that A. Philip Randolph was really, in many ways, the grandfather behind the March on Washington really sets the stage for the Poor People's Campaign in '68. When A. Philip Randolph gets up to give his speech, by the way, in 1963 at the March on Washington, it's initially more heavily covered by newspapers like the Times, like the Chicago Tribune, like the Post. It's much more heavily covered than Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, because in some ways, A. Philip Randolph's speech is more immediate, it's more compelling, and because Randolph is highlighting these themes. He said, it's great to have civil rights, but civil rights without economic rights are meaningless. If our people are still poor, it doesn't really matter that they can go into a Woolworths and just sit down whenever they want. I mean, that's important, but if you can't even afford to buy the burger in the first place, it doesn't really matter, right? So I say this because I want to emphasize something that James Baldwin says here. And James Baldwin, of course, became a friend with Dr. King towards the end of his life. And I just love this statement. I'm not going to read any of this really, and I'll give Carol a copy of this, and you can, or anyone a copy really of my presentation if you want to look it over. But it's essentially the kind of mindset in the civil rights movement that existed in 1967 that really helped launch the Poor People's Campaign. There was this understanding that middle-class America couldn't deal with poverty. Upper-class America, corporate America, the federal government, No one was dealing with poverty. And I love this idea that James Baldwin is saying here. He's like, you know, when we study society and people want to look at the health or the state of society, they always go and ask like the really famous people, like actors like or writers like him, or judges or people in middle class. They should talk to poor people, really. They should talk to poor Puerto Ricans, to poor Mexicans, to poor black people, any poor person, and ask them how they're doing in the society. And that's how you judge the health of any decent society. And that's kind of the animus and the spirit, in many ways, behind the Poor People's Campaign. So I'm going to do something unusual as a historian. I'm going to take you to the present and then kind of go back. So I was actually incredibly blessed to be in Washington, D.C., to be able to participate in the new Poor People's Campaign, one of the many events led by the Reverend William Barber, who I'll talk about in a moment here. This was a big event. There were like 60 to 70,000 people in D.C. It got almost no media coverage whatsoever. And I'll explain why it got no media coverage whatsoever as soon as I take a drink here. This was a march conceived along the lines of the original Poor People's Campaign. After Dr. King was assassinated, people did march, and you'll see this in this wonderful exhibit. And there's a great map that talks about the several cities that people left from: Denver, Los Angeles, Marks, Mississippi, where the Proctor program has interviewed people who actually were in Marks that went to DC from that very small town, but very historic town. But the campaign, you know, they did the march. They camped out like Dr. King wanted them to camp out. By this time, he'd been assassinated, of course. And some of them were in Washington, D.C. It depended. Some people got there early. People were the Poor People's Movement activists were in D.C. in 1968, anywhere from about 3 weeks to some people were there for 3 months. Ralph Abernathy and Jorge Gonzalez from Denver, and some of the Chicano leaders were there a bit longer. But when that march kind of stopped and dissipated, and the civil rights movement kind of begins to quiet down somewhat, the Poor People's Campaign continues to have this incredible resonance in American history, in American society. And so in 2016, the Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theoharis say they organized a number of meetings, and they said, you know, the Poor People's Campaign was a great idea. It was carried out, but it wasn't fully carried out. And so we're going to resuscitate it, literally. And so they organized a new Poor People's Campaign. That's what's happening now all across the country. There's a number of different types of events, which I'd be happy to talk about during Q&A, that they've been doing. But this rally was really memorable for me. I didn't have to do any organizing. I was just there. And the way it was organized was, again, along the lines of the original Poor People's Campaign. So the idea was that there were buses literally from every state of the union that brought poor people, working class people to Washington, D.C. to speak their own truths. And the rule was only poor and working class people were allowed to speak. No politicians were allowed to speak the entire day. Can you imagine? In Washington, D.C., they were forbidden to speak. And only 2 academics were allowed to speak the whole day. One of them, Cornel West, right, who's a great speaker. And the reason was that the march organizers, again, are following that original Poor People's Campaign idea of that poor people are best equipped to solve their own problems if they can figure out how to organize together, if they can have platforms, if they cannot be crushed by the police. When you read that news release, Dr. King says, we know that we're going to face violence. We know the state doesn't want us to do this. We know Lyndon Johnson is opposed to this. And don't get me started on what Richard Nixon said about the Poor People's Campaign, right? So Dr. King knew that they would face this repression, but he said, we got to continue doing it. And so fast forward several decades, and then William Barber and Liz Theoharis and a number of people, again, bring back this idea of the Poor People's Campaign. What I want to talk about is some of the ideological roots of that campaign. One of them, it's obviously based in a kind of, it's very multifaceted, both Christian ideas, Jewish ideas, Muslim, Buddhist, it's all of the above ideas of social justice. Obviously, Dr. King was a Christian minister. Reverend Liz Theoharis and Reverend Barber are Christian ministers too. And so they tap into these really rich veins of Christian social justice teaching. Jesus was a poor man. There's a depiction of Christianity here which is radically different than you'll see usually in the mainstream. It's a focus on the Sermon on the Mount. It's a focus on Jesus as a woke warrior, right? And you'll see in a lot of the statements that are issued by the new Poor People's Campaign that they base it both on this history of the original Poor People's Campaign, but a longer history in many ways of Christian socialism, of the Christian social justice gospel. These are some of the different groups. I took some photographs, so these are not professionally done. These are just ones I took. And this just gives you an example of the groups. I tried to get a good, sorry about this, Flo, for documentation purposes. This was the Florida contingent. But it says, all I could get was Orida, over and over again, Orida. Helen is actually holding some of the signs and you can just pass those around and hold those if you want. What I love about those signs is, again, the idea behind the Poor People's Campaign was that word that the state of Florida hates, inclusivity. Another word, intersectionality, okay?
I thought it was woke.
Woke. They didn't use woke back then as far as I know.
Okay.
They didn't really use intersectionality, but you'll see that during the time, and going back, and I apologize, this will be kind of like a roller coaster of history. In '68, when the Committee of 100, the leadership group, cadre, if you will, of the Poor People's Campaign, they arrived earlier than the people that set up the tent city in the mall. And they're going from congressman to congressman. They try to get audiences. They get audiences with like the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of the Interior. And you have to imagine delegations of African American, Native American, Asian American, Appalachian whites who go into these, like the Secretary of the Interior, and they demand like land reparations for Chicanos in the American Southwest, And the Secretary of the Interior is like, what? I think the guy at that time the Secretary of Agriculture, I think, was like the founder of the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota. I can't recall the guy's name, but it was stunning to see people from all these different groups get together. And this was part of the vision that Dr. King had that he hoped would come to fruition. Again, connecting, this is so cool because, connecting actually, as a historian, this is an unforgivable error. It should have been 2022. That's the wrong date, okay? So I'll leave that to Flo to correct that. I'll deposit this and she's gonna have to. But the fun thing is to think about how in 2022, we still have the same challenges which require us to kind of ramp up our analysis. Okay, fight poverty, not wars. That message you would have seen at a picket sign in 1968, and yet this is 2022 in Washington, D.C. Almost no coverage in the mainstream media. Very interesting, almost none for such a big event for people nationwide. Every state delegation, every speaker got 3 minutes, and Reverend Theoharis, it was very rigorous. I know I work with her sister, she's a professor at Brooklyn College, Jean Theoharis, and Reverend Barber. When you finished your 3 minutes, it was time to get off. And because they didn't have politicians speaking, everyone respected it sounds like I'm attacking politicians. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. But you can see the ideas. Reconstruction, right? There's a Reconstruction after the Civil War. There's an argument that the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s is the second Reconstruction. What the people in this new national movement are saying is we need a third Reconstruction. I love the way that history is invoked in these. I also love the touchscreen, by the way, Carol. Thank you. And just talking to people, just thousands of people from different organizations, Quakers, socialists, a lot of trade unionists were there. There's a whole like areas of like people chalking and doing really cool things, and like a graffiti wall too, which is awesome, I think. The police, interestingly enough, stayed away. There was no police at all anywhere within the whole rally area, which is quite large, but they made their presence known by like driving around and around and around the outskirts of the thing. But it was very important, this idea that we could police ourselves, because the idea behind the Poor People's Campaign is we can rebuild the society without militarism. We can rebuild the society without over-policing. And just zooming in a little bit here on Reverend Barber, created the Moral Monday movement earlier in the century, starts really in Raleigh, North Carolina, and going to the state legislature and protesting the what was then the new homophobic, anti-immigrant legislation that was just stifling in North Carolina. And instead of just watching this happen, they created the Moral Monday movement, and they would actually go on Mondays in mass civil disobedience and get arrested at the state legislature in Raleigh. And it was really inspiring. My dissertation advisor, Bill Chafe, who told us this story about how he had had the opportunity to get involved in the civil rights movement in the mid-60s. He was on a bus that somehow ended up he was actually an undergrad at Harvard. He ended up on a bus. They stopped in the Mississippi Delta. Stokely Carmichael got on the bus, leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Stokely said something to the effect that, okay, you rich white Ivy Leaguers have a choice. You can either risk your lives, you may not even live to the end of the day if you get off the bus and throw down with the movement, or you can live a long, comfortable life, stay on the bus and just leave. And my dissertation advisor, God love him, said, I decided to stay on the bus because he didn't want to get killed. But here he is, 45 years later, calls me out of the blue and says, Paul, I just got arrested. I said, you got what? He said he was arrested in the Moral Monday movement, protesting homophobia, protesting anti-immigrant legislation. And that is a kind of a critical precursor behind the rebirth of the Poor People's Campaign. Again, intersectionality. It begins with an understanding of the Black and traditions out of the Black freedom struggle, and grows into ideas of intersectionality and fighting injustice wherever you find it. And again, the emphasis here on a Christian social justice tradition. And it's interesting to think about the origins of that tradition. And that's Reverend Barber, of course, there. Poverty is measured by the U.S. Census Bureau. We could do a whole seminar on this. The U.S. Census Bureau estimates there are still about 38 million people living in poverty, but this doesn't count people who are living like one paycheck away from poverty. It doesn't count people who really have no resources, and so if one catastrophe happens, like a rise in healthcare costs, a significant rental increase, can just put you right into poverty. And so the poverty rates were trending down for a while. The official poverty rates were trending down a while in the 60s and 70s, but recently, very disturbingly, are beginning to go up, especially when the Earned Income Child Credit was ended last year. So it's still a huge problem. Again, these are some of the protest signs that people had in the 2022 Poor People's Rally. I want us to think about economic justice. Land loss is a huge issue. It was a huge issue in 1967, 68, and it still is a huge issue. The connection to immigration rights is increasingly big. But again, in the original Poor People's Movement campaign, Cesar Chavez was supposed to be one of the leaders that was going to come out to D.C. to take part in the activities, but he'd been taken ill because he had just finished a fast during the Great Boycott. These are some slides from the book I wrote, African American Latinx History of the United States. And Dr. King's death, in many ways, kind of interrupts the planning of the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign was originally going to take place earlier in 1968, and then something really remarkable happened that pushed Dr. King to kind of rethink the calendar, if you will, for when the Poor People's Campaign was going to start. The amazing thing that happened was the Memphis sanitation workers strike, where 1,300 garbage men, as they were called, went out on strike, on a wildcat strike. It was not authorized by any union because they weren't unionized at that point. When the sanitation workers in Memphis went out on strike, Dr. King had this aha moment. He said, here we are in our Southern Christian Leadership Conference meetings, strategizing. Again, it's mainly middle-class folk, strategizing about how to end poverty, and you have 1,300 of the lowest paid workers in Memphis who have come upon a formula to just abolish poverty for 1,300 people and their families at one fell swoop. And so he looks around at Jesse Jackson and Rustin and all the others, and he says, man, we need to go to Memphis. And so he goes to Memphis to find out what's happening. And when he gets there, he discovers that the place is really like, it is a war zone. Martial law has been declared. The workers, all the sanitation workers are out on strike. There's other strikes as well. The governor is demanding federal troops. And basically you can see that Memphis is a city under a state of siege. I mean, you don't get in and out of Memphis without being searched several times, in or out. But the strike holds. People don't cave in. The workers don't lose. I mean, there's a lot of police beatings of strikers, but they hold solid. And the churches get mobilized, and they're doing incredible food banks, blood drives. They're helping to pay each other's rent. If you're behind in your bills and you're a striking worker, there's fraternal organizations like the Masons, the Pythians, and others who are helping to pay people's bills. The idea is this community has got to win this strike because it could be a game changer for the entire community, whether you are or not a garbage worker. And so Dr. King gets completely invested in this, and this is why he keeps coming back to Memphis. He gives one of the greatest speeches in American history. I've been at the mountaintop. He knows that his life is going to end here. He's told repeatedly, Dr. King, if you come back to Memphis, you're going to be killed. I mean, that's all there is to it. And that's why he gives the I've been to a mountaintop speech. He is predicting his own assassination. He's saying, I will not get there actually with you to the promised land, but I can see it, but you just have to keep fighting. And this is one of the most important moments in all of American history. I mean, as a labor historian, I think all roads lead to Memphis, Tennessee in April of 1968. And when Dr. King is assassinated, he has made several statements saying that it's the sanitation workers who have really taught us the power of poor people organized. And we have to find ways to replicate that. We have to find ways to extend that. And at the same time, on the eve of his assassination, he's a very vilified man. All of the major newspapers, the New York Times, the Post, Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson for that matter, they're all writing these very angry op-eds against Dr. King, and especially on these issues of poverty, unions, and especially his opposition to the American war in Vietnam. Especially the fact that he's able to connect all these issues together. We don't have enough resources to properly educate people, to properly house people, to properly make sure they have a decent wage. Why can't the federal government, he would say frequently, he would make fun of the space program, believe it or not. He'd say, he'd be like, a lot of us have listened to Gil Scott-Heron's wonderful, Whitey on the Moon thing. But Dr. King was saying that years earlier. He was like, I don't understand the space thing. What's the big deal about it? You have people in Marks, Mississippi, living, he would see hundreds of children even without shoes on their feet. So he would say, tell me what is so big about going to space? So anyway, when he died, there's this shock and there's grief, national grief. There's obviously anger. People riot. There's a lot of agony. There's a lot of second thoughts. I think that some of the people, I would hope at least some of them who wrote the most, I share some of these op-eds with my students and they're so angry. The ones that were written right before Dr. King was assassinated, they're like, how can you talk so poorly how can you attack someone so viciously for speaking truth, to power, for advocating on behalf of poor people? But in my research for an African-American Latinx history, I found a whole series of articles that were written by and for poor people about Dr. King. This is not Newsweek, this is not Time, this is not the Chicago Tribune or the LA Times. So in the Farm Worker newsletter, which this is an organization that's becoming the United Farm Workers Union, co-founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, this is how they give meaning to Dr. King's life, killed helping workers to organize. And the I Am a Man picket sign speech in the back is, of course, the iconic picket sign that was used during the sanitation workers' strike. And it's a special issue. You can actually find it online now, thanks to our wonderful librarians and archivists. They've digitized this. And the whole issue is essentially connecting Dr. King's critiques of the war in Vietnam, the struggles of poor farm workers to organize, and the struggle to democratize the country. But basically, the newsletter said, the union says you can't have democracy as long as people are so poor. Why would you even talk about democracy? Dr. King was frequently asked, President Johnson said, I'd like you to go to Watts, talk to these young Negro youth who have been rioting. Dr. King, you, above all people, know how to talk about nonviolence. Tell them that violence doesn't solve any problems. And Dr. King was like, what? What are you talking about? The same youth who've been involved in rioting, you're drafting them. You send them to Fort Dix, you send them to Fort Bragg at the time, now I guess it's Fort Liberty, and you train them to kill people. And so you want me to talk to them about nonviolence? Are you insane? And this is where all these ideas are coming together really into the Poor People's Campaign. One of my dear friends, Mike Honey, has written several books about Dr. King in the labor movement. This is not the sanitation workers' strike. Dr. King walked a lot of picket lines with unions in the North and in the Upper South. This is a scripted employees strike, which was a few years before the sanitation workers' strike. But this is a typical kind of Dr. King photograph. He goes to be on a picket line to bring attention to the strike, to try to get support for the strikers so that they can win their battle. He's a frequent speaker at the AFL-CIO National Convention, at the United Auto Workers, the United Rubber Workers, District 65, you name it. He's there talking about, and he has a number of phrases. The Negro hater is also the labor baiter. The person who fights unions is the same person that keeps our people in poverty. They're the same reactionary forces. And he learned these things from that older generation of civil rights activists, people like E.D. Nixon, the president of the Sleeping Car Porters Union in Montgomery, Alabama, who's so key to the Montgomery bus boycott because Nixon has a connection to the United Auto Workers in Detroit. He knows Walter Reuther, and he gets money to help pay for cars to run this alternative bus service during the Montgomery bus boycott. But that's funded in part by the United Auto Workers Union in Detroit. And AFL Brandolph has a connection to C.L. Dellums, who was one of the founders of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. You know him as the father of Ron Dellums, the very radical congressman from Oakland, who also trained none other than Barbara Lee, one of our most radical anti-war congresspeople today. That's the importance of this intergenerational theme that I'm trying to get across. This movement is not just episodic. It's stories, it's tactics, it's struggles that are passed down from generation to generation. But the labor movement and the intersectionality, this idea of Negro and Puerto Rican communities, this is an iconic healthcare strike that happened in 1962. And my students were like, we didn't know Malcolm X was, supported unions. And I'm like, well, of course, I don't think your history textbooks want you to know that. They want you to see Malcolm X as this kind of isolated black nationalist person. But this is the milieu that gives birth to this idea that economic justice has to be at the foundation of the black freedom struggle, of the brown freedom struggle, of the Puerto Rican struggle, Native Americans, and these are groups. And you'll see in the exhibit when you walk through that there was actually a Puerto Rican Day during the Poor People's Campaign, and the different communities had cultural events that they would invite everyone to come and learn about our Puerto Rican traditions of poetry, music, politics, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to talk a little bit about the heritage of the Poor People's Campaign. I mentioned the idea of Christian socialism, Christian social justice. Howard Thurman, we all should know who he is. He was a Floridian. He grew up in Daytona Beach. His grandmother was an enslaved African-American woman from Madison County, Florida. She taught him Christianity. Reverend Thurman was Dr. King's spiritual advisor. That's how Dr. King referred to him. Howard Thurman was a contemporary of Dr. King's father. He was a very close friend of people like Benjamin Mays, of the major black political, religious, kind of educational leaders of the 1930s and 40s. He was a contemporary and a correspondent of Gandhi in India. He actually traveled to India to study the anti-colonial movement. And Thurman became this larger-than-life impact figure, mainly behind the scenes. In Florida, he did a lot of work for Hispanic students. He actually helped a lot of Cuban-American students in the 1930s and 40s get admission to historically black colleges, like what becomes Bethune-Cookman, for example, Florida Memorial, even Tuskegee. You'll see a lot of Hispanic students in those institutions, and Thurman is one of the people that promotes that kind of working together. Again, look at the social justice message here. And Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited, to me, is one of the greatest books of the 20th century in theology and philosophy and politics. And the thesis, the argument is just so elegant. It's basically that this is a religion, Christianity, that started as a religion of oppressed people, but it lost its way. And it lost its way in the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And instead of being a religion of oppressed people, it became a religion for the oppressor and the imperialist, and something to impose upon people, right? This is one of the things that Thurman learned from Gandhi. Thurman asked, Mr. Gandhi, why are there so few Christians in India? And Gandhi's response supposedly was, well, because the British are Christians. And we learned and Gandhi pushed Thurman. And he said, how can your people be Christians? He said, I don't get it. They enslaved you under Christianity. And it pushed Thurman to explicate, to talk about how enslaved African Americans, like his grandmother, brought Christianity back to its original roots as a religion of the oppressed. And I talk about this in Emancipation Betrayed, my Florida book. And in fact, I begin the preface really by talking about Howard Thurman is a very young boy. He's just learned how to read, and his grandmother is with him on a porch in Daytona Beach. and he's reading passages of the Bible for her, and she forbids him to read the Pauline epistles. But she loves the Bible except for that one part, because that's the one part where Paul had been the colonial administrator for the Roman Empire, and that's the part that includes the slaves obey thy masters, right? And she forbids him to read that. And it's disturbing to him because he's trying to figure out what happened here to this religion. So he has an enormous impact on Dr. King and many of the ministers who end up leading the movement. Carol asked me before if on the Way to the Poor People's Campaign there were people from Florida that participated in 1968, and there were, but I don't know of any town that participated. Basically, the people I have heard went from like Jacksonville, or actually mainly, Quincy, and traveled to the Delta, and then went up from Marks to DC. I don't know of any like direct group that went from, North or Central Florida. But this is the understanding that the Poor People's Campaign has, that racism is a national problem. It's a problem that hits Mexican, Puerto Ricans, Native American people, and they have a very kind of big tent attitude towards fighting racism. We're not in this struggle alone. This is a sign that people in my father's generation grew up with, and you just have to kind of imagine, these photographs are really stunning. You imagine being a parent and having to take your child, downtown or anywhere near these horrific signs. So just kind of wrapping up here, and I'll take questions and answers in just a few minutes. And this goes back to your handout. When that news release was released, Dr. King essentially tried to distill some of the major demands that the Poor People's Campaign was articulating. He said it wasn't enough to be symbolic. It wasn't enough to go there and have a big march. I mean, the Poor People's Campaign is rooted in generations of poor people's marches to Washington, D.C. One of the most famous ones you may have read about was called the Bonus March, that happened towards the beginning of the Great Depression. A lot of American veterans of World War I and even the Spanish-American War marched on Washington, D.C. to try to get their bonus because they were so impoverished. They'd been promised a bonus by the federal government, and instead of giving them their bonus, the federal government sent Douglas MacArthur to crush them. There was Coxey's Army in 1890s, maybe 1891. But there were generations of people who would march to either state capitals or the federal capital to demand some kind of federal relief. And so, again, the Poor People's Campaign is part of that history. But the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Dr. King, want to make sure that there's concrete demands connected to this event. And you'll find this in Dr. King's final book, Chaos or Community, Where Do We Go From Here? Published by Beacon Press, published originally, Coretta Scott King, Dr. King's wife, writes an amazing preface for the book. But these are the demands these aren't like invented in 1968. These have always been around. These have been things that people like A. Philip Randolph, people like Ella Baker, people like Fannie Lou Hamer were talking about in the early 60s in Mississippi. Full employment, raising the minimum wage, affordable housing. Of course, we've solved all these issues, right? and you can see the universality of these demands. I mean, Dr. King and the SCLC conceive, and you'll see this when you march, I would say march through. You can march through if you want, but when you walk through and you see the exhibit of these incredible photographs, this campaign is really conceived as a universal kind of struggle or movement against economic impoverishment, against political oppression. But the idea is that, again, kind of coming full circle to Randolph's insights as a union president, the civil rights doesn't really matter much unless you have economic justice. But how hard is it to get any, the federal government or the state or city to build houses? I mean, you've got to, you got to march. You have to agitate. Full employment, enhanced federal jobs program. In the 60s, there was still a lot of people around that remember the Works Progress Administration from the Great Depression. They said, the federal government created millions of jobs for unemployed teachers, writers, artists, canal diggers, et cetera, et cetera. Why couldn't you do it again? Frequently, the SCLC would say, hey, you're still doing the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. You're giving millions of dollars to France and West Germany and some of these other nations. Why can't some of that aid come here, okay, to uplift our own people, as it were? The attacks against the Poor People's Campaign, and one of the handouts, I only brought one of them, historians and writers, even as I speak, are actually unearthing new documents using the Freedom of Information Act. J. Edgar Hoover saw the Poor People's Campaign as like public enemy number one. He already hated Dr. King. He spent years trying to take him down. So what the FBI was doing, one of the things in that wiki document that I passed around is just a 2-pager, and basically the first page is a directive by an FBI official saying, spread this op-ed around. Now, the op-ed is pretty insidious, and what it says, if memory serves, it's pretty small print, I could barely read it. But it's very typical for an FBI operation of subversion. The op-ed is just a short news item that did run. It did run in newspapers, and the item says something to the effect that, these white people in the American Friends Service Committee are so overbearing, and they don't work well with black people, and the black people have forbidden them to attend any of their meetings. That was a lie. Right. That didn't happen. But the FBI, they were trying to undermine and sabotage the campaign and try to get these groups separated from each other. Dr. King's challenge was, how do you keep these groups together? It's never easy. You all know this. I mean, everyone here has been involved in some kind of coalition building. It's the hardest thing to do. It's even harder when the federal government is against you. The last slide I'll share with you is, again, this is from my earlier book, African American Latinx History of the United States. And it's really cool. I remember when I got a call from a former student who was organizing in the Smithfield poultry processing enormous complex in eastern North Carolina, employs about 10,000 plus workers. And he called me out of the blue one evening, and he said that the Mexican and Central American workers went out on strike. And I said, why? This was not reported in the papers, obviously. And he said they're out on strike demanding the right to be able to commemorate Martin Luther King Day. And their bosses had said, you people are Mexicans. What does Dr. King have to do with you? And they're like, apparently we know more about Dr. King than y'all do, because if you did know about him, you would know exactly why we want to, because they weren't asking for like a holiday to just kind of hang out and have a barbecue. They had planned a whole series of educational events. This is really cool. But it kind of brings us back in some ways to that spirit behind the Poor People's Campaign, where there's culture being shared, there's political struggles, there's a realization that, you may speak a different language than I do, or we may come from different parts of the town, but unless we have some kind of economic security, we cannot have a just society. So as you're going through the wonderful exhibit, just have a good time. Think about the issues that were raised in 1968. You'll have no problem thinking about those issues still resonating. And again, I just want to thank Carol Richardson for making this possible. Thanks for your patience. You've been a great audience. I'm happy to answer questions or... Helen.
You had mentioned that the organization on the summer of 2022 was self-police, basically, in the security. But were there any counter-protesters that were there that needed a little extra attention?
That's a good question. Counter-protesters. Deborah reminded me to repeat the question. So were there, because it's being recorded, were there counter-protesters in 2022? I don't recall any. I mean, I was there most of the day.
That's pretty
I mean, they may have been on one side or another side, but I think part of the reason there weren't maybe was because there were just so many people there. I mean, you can see, well, maybe you can't see like how close we were to, what building was it behind the, because this will give you kind of an idea. Yeah, okay, so the speaker's podium is here. So you see the Capitol building, you know, is right behind us. And I think that was done obviously on purpose. And I just don't remember any counter protesters at all. I don't remember people heckling or.
So was that like Capitol Street or was that Pennsylvania Avenue?
Pennsylvania, Flo, I think. Because I remember I got off the metro, I got off the Pennsylvania stop right across from National Archives. So that's Pennsylvania.
Right, okay.
So and then walked straight towards, 10th Street.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I have another question about the 1968 march. The poor people's. Was the unemployment compensation benefits? Did that come out of that march? Like a tangible event? I
Yes.
can't remember when unemployment.
Yeah. So some of the
came about.
some of the tangible things that happened, there was a form of workers we called workman's compensation.
Right.
What came out of the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 were some concessions. One of them was an improvement in the unemployment system.
Right.
Also, there was a restoration of funding. I mean, believe it or not, even though Head Start had just started in 65, it suffered a major cut in 1967.
Sure.
And so the war, yeah, exactly. So that was one of the things, the cut was largely restored because the way the Johnson administration responded to this mass movement was, well, we're not going to do anything directly about poverty, but we can give you more money for education, okay? That Head Start funding for people in the Mississippi Delta, in West Texas, and Central Valley of California and Eastern Washington, that's life or death funding. It's not, when you think of Head Start, I mean, what it meant to poor people in those days was enormous. So we never want to minimize that, but Head Start was under siege almost the moment it started. We saw, by the way, the first group of UF students I took to the Delta in 2008, we went for a kind of a community celebration at the Head Start auditorium in downtown Greenwood, Mississippi. And we're doing this big, the kids are putting on a play for us. And out of nowhere, guess who walks into the auditorium? Congressman John Lewis.
Oh, wow.
And he gives us a big pep talk about, we got a big election coming up, y'all. It is the summer of 2008. And he found out that we had this 2 tables of Florida people, and he walked right over to us, and it made a big impact on our students, believe me. And he said, I want you people to go back to Florida and get people out to vote. He said, our lives depend on it. But it was just as great, again, the history. And the Head Start building was like, for the community of Greenwood, it was really like a church. It was really a sacred place. And they did everything there in addition to, the kids' education, adult education classes, nice big auditorium. A lot of people, hundreds of people were there that evening. John Lewis came in and someone handed him a mic. He said, I don't need a microphone. And he didn't really need a microphone, but anyway. Other questions or observations or, yes?
A question for Carol. How long will the exhibit be up?
It'll be up until May.
And some of the other speakers,
Yes, so February the 15th, Dr. Gwendolyn Zahara Simmons will be a speaker, and she was there in 1968 and participated in the mobilizing. So her topic is going to be about what it takes to mobilize communities and what it was like for her being a student. And then March the 15th, we have Dr. Alyssa Cole from the African American
Excellent.
Studies department at UF. She's going to talk about health, equity, and community. And she's going to look at some of the conditions that were happening out west, like in Kansas, and how this march affected those that live there. We have Dr. Emma Shaw coming in with March 28th in partnership with UF Humanities. And she's going to do a workshop on collaboration, how the universities and communities can work better together for causes. And then we're going to end April with a musical, art, poetry, and culture of the 60s. So please follow us on Facebook. There's a couple flyers. I want to just say thank you to Dr. Ortiz. I want to say thank you also to our sponsors. I know we're being recorded, so I better get this out. To the City of Gainesville, the City of Gainesville Parks, Recreation, Cultural Affairs, and most important to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture for sharing this with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we should just kind of release folks to look at the. Oh, more questions? Okay, yeah.
Okay, and I just want to say there are some refreshments in the back, light refreshments, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Question?
How do I say this now? The two little things I have to say, Dr. Ortiz. And both of them will lead up to a question. The first one will be rhetorical. And you mentioned the opposition that Dr. King had to field, throughout, all that he did, even under the name of nonviolence, which, I mean, you can't get any better than that. One of the most chilling things that I've ever experienced in my life is hearing the actual recording of J. Edgar Hoover when Dr. King was in prison one at a time, calling him up and teasingly asking how he was doing, and said, I listened to the man's words and it chilled me. He said, so it didn't work, boy. Something, I'm not quoting him verbatim, just, so you know what you have to do now, don't you? You know what you have to do now. Just go ahead and do it. And I said, how could someone who's running the justice system for a democratic Christian country be telling a man who's leading the country with nonviolence? Dr. King almost had his own people turn against him because he insisted on nonviolence. How could a man be so cold as to be telling this man to go ahead and commit suicide? And so my question, which is rhetorical, which is the first one, is, and I've been under the foot of that building many times, why do we still have his name on the building in Washington, D.C. on F Street? It should be erased. And that would be something on my bucket list. The second thing is, I saw the list of demands that they made. Yeah. And I see it didn't include healthcare, universal healthcare. And I've done a little bit of research and found out that it was a German a German man who came here, married a Southern belle, who saw not giving health care to African American people as a way to achieve eugenics. And so it was already under the foundation festering when Obamacare came about. So it was so easy for people to push it aside. And I wonder, why didn't they have something like healthcare on there, and land as well?
So I should have said that, and this, you'll find these demands either implicit or explicit within that news release. But after Dr. King was assassinated, there were a lot of other demands. There was actually a thing called the Economic Bill of Rights, and there may be a panel on it in the exhibit. And yeah, they made a whole raft of demands, including health care, and including reparations, including restoration of stolen land from Native American people. I mean, so if you think about the Poor People's Campaign, it was kind of like, a house with many mansions, or like a really big tent. And when that committee of 100 people went around to these different federal offices, mean, they realized they couldn't take everyone. And so they just took like, they'd have like 10 leaders would go to the Interior Department, 10 people would go to Health and Human Services, and they would make different demands and try to start dialogues with these different federal agencies. So healthcare did come up. The thing about the J. Edgar Hoover, yeah, to me, working that summer in the National Archives, I had to get off to stop and see, and I'm like, God, this guy really hated the country. He hated democracy, and he made no bones about that. And he ruined many people's lives. He destroyed trade unions. He was just he was a terrible person. And so, yeah, why is his name on that building? Yeah.
I'll start the movement to get it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we had, locally we had the movement about, renaming J.J. Finley to Carolyn Parker. And I was actually, I remember Evelyn Fox called me one evening and she said, Paul, you're now the official historian of the Alachua County NAACP. I said, okay. And basically she said, I want you, her first job for me was find out if there should be a school named after J.J. Finley. And it took me about 3 hours to find out, no. There should not be a parking lot named after J.J. Finley. And being a Confederate general, by the way, was the least of his problems. There were many other things. But yeah, these buildings. I mean, one of the things that Dr. King said about history was, and it was one of the last statements he made, was that the attempt to erase Black history is akin to homicide. Because if you can convince any group of people that have no history, you've essentially just destroyed them, right? Wiped them out. And I think that's one of the things that makes Hoover and his kind of Cold War acolytes, had such a devastating impact on this country. Again, that document I just shared with you was just, I think, recently declassified, but only through Freedom of Information.
You think Hoover was worse than Andrew Jackson?
He was what?
Was he worse than Andrew Jackson?
Oh, I almost said apples and oranges, maybe like thorns and yeah, pretty bad people. I mean, I can tell you. Let me share an anecdote about Andrew Jackson. So again, taking the oral history group students, you have students to Porch Creek Nation, Indian Reservation in southeastern Alabama. And we did a day of service with the Native American tribal archivists. And we're going through these old boxes. And we're helping them to kind of pick out documents to digitize and preserve. And a group of my students found all these these title, deed, land claims. And they're looking at the signature and they're like, this isn't the Andrew Jackson, is it? Yeah. I'm like, yeah. What is a general doing signing land deeds? I'm like, there you go. Now you understand U.S. history. Because all those generals were in the business of expropriating, stealing land from Native Americans and using the U.S. military to back them up. Anyway, so he's apples and oranges. I don't know. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'm curious if there were any organized labor unions or other establishment organizations that supported, even though the Memphis strikers weren't organized, with their other unions supporting
Yes.
that, and the Poor People's Campaign itself. I know Walter Reuther was involved, but were there other establishment union and political parties or organizations that were supporting them?
Yes, so with the sanitation workers strike, and the interesting thing about the sanitation workers strike is, and I'm a big beneficiary of the sanitation, public school teachers, postal workers, that strike is really the catalyst for the growth of public sector unionism. Because remember, the sanitation workers are municipal workers. And that strike, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, which is what they go into, Local 1733, AFSCME had been around a long time, but it was mainly a very kind of small, declining union. But after they succeeded in Memphis, suddenly AFSCME undergoes this incredible national growth among all these different kind of professional occupations. In fact, after Dr. King was shot down, Coretta Scott King becomes a leader, like an AFSCME kind of public relations person. And so AFSCME goes in and they unionize a lot of public healthcare employees. That's one of their next big campaigns. So the sanitation workers strike has this incredible impact on the labor movement. The Postal Wildcat happens just 3 years later. And there's evidence that some of the early activities in Memphis and Nashville among letter carriers were connected to the sanitation strike. Now, the Poor People's Campaign, as you can imagine, Ruther and the United Auto Workers donated, I think, $50,000 to the campaign. Other unions donated funding. The sleeping car porters by then had shrunk. There weren't that many people. Sleeping cars were really kind of going out of style in the early 60s. But there were several other unions, the rubber workers, the meat packers, very progressive, very interracial, a lot of Hispanic, Black, Mexican, Anglo members, very supportive, and a few other unions were too. AFL-CIO, not as much. George Meany, enough said. George Meany was a friend of old J. Edgar, so he took a very kind of, very dim view of it. A great audience, and just have a good time. I can stick around a little longer and maybe answer any questions as you're going through there. And yeah, thank you, Carol.